Welcome to this Euranet Plus debate on digital roaming. Our programme today is presented within the Citizens Corner concept. The debate is produced and hosted by Euranet Plus and Radio Romania International, a member of the Euranet Plus network. The debate can be followed live from European Parliament on our Euranet Plus Inside website, on our Facebook profile, as well as on Twitter using the hashtag CitizensCornerEU. I'm Brian Maguire. Joining us today to discuss Europe's digital roaming market, Pavel Šaki, MEP from Slovakia and from the EPP group in the European Parliament, Wolf-Dietrich Grossman, Head of Unit for Implementation of the Regulatory Framework of the European Commission's DG Connect. Welcome. Ursula Packel, Deputy Director General of the European Consumer Organisation, and Brian Curtis, European Economic and Social Committee for the section of Transport, Energy, Infrastructure and the Information Society. We're also joined by Christina from UBB Radio at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Romania. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. Well, digital roaming was supposed to be the big thing that every European citizen would understand, that it was good for everybody, it was good for Europe, and then we had this whole policy mess where it got pushed back and forward from announcement to retraction. Where did this really go wrong? And Paul, do you think that the messaging can be improved again for the political side?
I think yes. I think maybe the basic situation is to declare that we are living in the age of communication. That's an important issue for everybody in the European Union. I think the general process is going on very, very positively. If we see the situation 10 years ago, the current situation is much more better. I think the Commission may declare that the general level of the expenses for the roaming were decreased for 10 or less percent, 8%. If we compare maybe the situation from 2013. So generally, this is the general orientation of the process is good. It's also good that the political level, the European Parliament and the European Commission is active concerning this issue, which is maybe a good message to the Europeans and to the citizens. Now, on the table, we have a next step, which is not a final step. The process will be I hope, continue also in the future. We are waiting now for the final decision of the European Commission to 15th of December, because they are waiting for the position of European regulators for electronic communications, and after that we will see the details also of the decision. But generally, I think that's a success story, and I am happy that it's good to discuss this question also here at the table. Thank you.
Wolf-Dietrich Grossman, can you explain to us just a little bit about the process that's going on? We thought this was all done, it's back on the table. What's holding it up?
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. I mean, I would strongly support what was said, that we are, I think, well on track. It's not that, I think you used the term mess, which I would object to. I think we are in a process which was determined by the co-legislator last year when they decided to abolish surcharges for roaming, which I think is a very good news. But there were some follow-up steps to be taken, and that involves in principle two pillars, if you want, one of which is another co-legislative activity, because at the time last year what was abolished were surcharges for consumers. This is the so-called retail level aspect, whereas it was left open how the operators would exchange their commercial practices at the wholesale level, and this is an important topic which needs to be addressed as well, and that's why the Commission was invited to come up with a proposal how this wholesale market should be further regulated. It is already regulated with caps, and the Commission has proposed quite significant reductions of that caps, and that is at the moment in Council and Parliament under discussion, and should hopefully be adopted in time, so that next year, Roam Like at Home, the new concept can enter into force and become applicable. The second pillar is another deliverable which was foreseen in the so-called TSM, which is the regulation of last year, which is an implementing act on two further aspects which are also important in that context, and that is a so-called fair use policy, which is in principle allowed under the compromise concluded last year, and a so-called sustainability mechanism, which was also agreed last year for operators in countries that have problems with
Okay.
not increasing the domestic prices. I think it's a very important aspect because the waterbed effect was something that was very much.
Okay.
And on that one, we are at the moment discussing and hopefully get an adoption on the 15th of December by the Commission.
Excellent. Thank you. Ursula Packel, how does this look for consumers? Is this just bad messaging, bad marketing, but actually the product's all right?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to comment here on the current situation on roaming. Actually, I have to say, first of all, that already in 2010, consumers were promised the end of roaming by 2015. So it's true that this is delayed, but we are very much optimistic that in 2017 the end of roaming fees will be a reality for consumers. So we have this roam like at home concept that the European legislators have agreed upon, and now everything depends on how this will be implemented. And in relation to what Mr. Grossman just said, I think it's very important to underline that the next few months and the work of the European legislators, so the Parliament and the Council, but also the Commission, will be absolutely essential in order to see what will be the reality of the roam like at home concept, because in the end this is what consumers have been promised. This is what consumers should expect and can expect from a true single market, that you can travel freely around in Europe without having to be afraid of a bill shock in case you just keep on using your preferred digital services, or if you want to stay connected with your family and friends. So these two measures, the wholesale legislation that will decide on what your national operator has to pay if you go and roam, and the fair use, so-called fair use policy, will be absolutely decisive.
Okay, Brian Curtis, how do you view this? Do you think this is going in the right direction?
Well, I think it's definitely going in the right direction, but it's taken a long time to get there.
Why is it taking so long?
Well, it's Europe. These are the sort of things that take a lot of time. You update a regulation and it takes you a year, 2 years. What concerns me, I think everyone around the table, we all think that we're looking forward to April, I think next year, that we will have this in. So, and there's broad agreement everywhere. But I think there's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross before we get to where we need to be. I'm concerned about that some of the providers will look for ways to increase their profitability. So I think it's important that the Commission keeps its eye on transparencies, particularly people who are offering bundles. You know, it needs to be transparent so the consumers can look at actually what they're paying for. Personally, I mean, I've looked at the Commission's document. I spend half my life looking at Commission's document and criticising them and picking holes in them. This one is pretty good. It's seeking to achieve the right things. I also think that their proposed maximum average wholesale charges, I think that that's quite reasonable. I think that is an opportunity for the industry to get together, and there's still a reasonable way for people to get healthy competition within that area. All I will say is that I think that the Commission really needs to be on the front foot now to make sure that we reach the April deadline for next year. Okay. I mean, I think.
Let me bring to Palchak. Part of the problem with this is how the different member states have different vested interests. The big telecoms industries in Spain, for example, and other countries which don't have such a monopoly on the market. How are the trade-offs working in this? How does Council get to resolve some of these price issues which will really affect the revenue stream within individual member states?
You're right, it's a very, very complicated issue and very complicated system generally in Europe. And don't forget, please, that the level of prices is different for different European countries. There is here a very clear difference between the Western European countries and Eastern European countries. The system of the services copied this situation. So I think there are here, of course, from the beginning of the process, two big groups. One group is the group of the citizens, the group of us. We have an ambition to protect their rights and their chances, but on the other hand, there is here a group of operators, and their position is not also easy because they must guarantee for 24 hours for every day a well-functioning system, and all solutions must be sustainable. That's I think clear for everybody. So that's not easy to create a good balance in one country and a good balance in the European level, because this, the relations and the situations are different. But generally, that's the role, I think, of the political elite of the European Parliament and the European Commission too, to press these, to make some pressure, political pressure too, and legislative pressure for the bettering of the situation, for the increasing of the level of well balance. And I think the term of fair use policies is a very key element of the whole of this process.
Okay. With the element that Paul mentioned about all solutions have to be sustainable. Do you risk breaking the communications market if you're too heavy-handed with this, or is there an overall economic growth and overall benefit from reducing roaming prices?
I mean, all regulatory interventions taken so far place have not destroyed the telecommunications market as such. So I think we should have the right proportion there in our mind. But I think what is a real paradigm shift is that with the introduction of Roam Like at Home, we are now getting very close to the real costs involved for provision of services. I mean, the starting point of roaming regulation was some price levels which were exorbitant above the cost. So it was easy to harmonize them and lower them always down. Now the principle is that you should charge the same charge that you are charging at home, at your domestic level. And that, of course, was always supposed to competition, so the prices on the domestic level have gone down quite significant also over the last decade, and in different at different levels in the different countries. So that's one of the problems now being involved. So it's true that we have to find the balance right, and I think the right trigger is to get the balance right in Parliament and Council when it comes to the wholesale prices, because if the wholesale level is at the right level, you don't need a fair use policy on the best side. I mean, fair use policy is an option for operators, but it's not that they have to apply it. And of course, if the conditions are set in a way that they can even live without the fair use policy applied, even better. So I think from that perspective, we will not crack down the telecommunication markets, but it's a more difficult exercise than in the past to get the balance right.
Okay, Christine, you have a question for the panel?
Yes. If United Kingdom leaves the European Union, how are they going to charge those people who phone in UK?
Ursula, do you have an answer for that?
That's not an easy question, I have to say. I have to think about it. But I think it would depend on which consumer you look at. Do you look at the consumer who is roaming, traveling to the UK and then phoning back home? I think it would really depend on what legislation the UK would want to implement, if they would like to still stay with the wholesale legislation and have the same market conditions available. So I think it's an open question, but we will definitely do the utmost to ensure that both consumers in the UK and on the continent, so to speak, will benefit still from good roaming situations.
Brian Curtis, do any problems with this?
Yeah, I mean, how long is a piece of string? It's like everything connected with Brexit. Nobody really knows the answer. I mean, I think if you asked the Prime Minister of the UK, she would say, I want to keep everything we've got. This is what we want to do. But there's a price to pay for being a member of the club, and she doesn't want to pay that price. So who knows? My guess will be that when deals are being done, this will not be the most difficult one to do. That would be my best guess. It's in everyone's interest. And so I would have thought that when the negotiations, who knows, let's say 18 months, 2 years' time down the line, I would have thought that this would have been a fairly simple one to solve.
Pal, Jackie, you may have a different view on this.
I try to form a not politically motivated answer. I am not a fan of Brexit I was very kind of surprised by this decision, but of course we have to respect also this decision of citizens of UK. But and we are not able now to see all details of the Brexit discussion. But I think the services, the question of the services, the question of economic relations, the question of financial relations will be maybe minimally these three areas in which I'm not waiting for big changes. So I think the situation will be very similar or the same as today. The political relations, some other relations maybe will be more complicated for the government of the United Kingdom and for the European Commission too. But I'm waiting for the better maybe and more intelligent solutions concerning services, economy and financing.
You're waiting for more intelligent solutions to come. Good luck. Wolf Dietrich, the complexity of this Brexit question as well, it's made more complicated by the fact that the ownership of many telecommunications companies, it's not fixed in one country, and one loss or change in revenue in the UK or cross-border is going to impact in a Spanish company or a French company as well, in a way which perhaps doesn't affect other markets. Is there a sensitivity to the digital market being different in the context of Brexit?
Look, I hope you understand I will not enrich the speculations on the Brexit
I
at this
understand,
point
but you
in
can
time.
if you really want to.
The position of the Commission is we are waiting for an application on Article 50 and then we will start negotiating and reflecting on all the questions that you have raised here.
Okay, don't hold your breath now. Article 50 been triggered either. Let's see how that happens. Christine, do you have another question?
Yes. Do you think this expensive as in roaming tax is going to have an impact on the economy?
Frank Curtis.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought a major impact. We've been moving towards this for some considerable time now. Some of the steps have already been made. It's only the final negotiations now, I think, that need to be done. I mean, I think like everything in Europe, different member states take a view, and they don't all take the same view, and so that slows the negotiations down. But I think we're almost there with this.
Okay. Ursula, let me ask you about if we compare the European market to the American market. I hesitate to make a comparison directly again with the United States, but it's a similar market in terms of how it functions. What lessons should Europe learn from how it functions?
Well, I think the major lesson, and this is very important not only in the context of roaming, but in the overall context of the European Union legislative framework on the telecommunication market, is that competition is absolutely key. And we have seen a decrease in competition in the US with a lot of negative consequences for the consumers there. And we hope that the current situation in terms of the legislation that we have that really aims at maintaining and inspiring and motivating competition in the telecoms market should also be maintained, and there should not be a trade-off between the current discussion is about a trade-off, so to speak, between investment and maybe then impact on competition and maybe even less consumer rights, because providers are kind of sad to have to invest, and then they cannot, of course, be subject to an increased competition. We think that is the wrong approach. And in relation to roaming, the question was, why has it taken so long? Well, certainly because roaming was a very profitable market, and there have been cartel-like situations, and it has taken a lot of political will throughout all these years to come to a situation where we are now. We think that the end of roaming, or the end of normally roaming fees, is really a win-win situation. It should really benefit not only consumers but also providers, because we expect, and that's the figures of the European Commission, that there would be extra demand in the height of around 300 million customers who would use more telecom services. So this is really a win-win, not only for consumers but for Europe as a whole.
Okay, Wolf Dietrich, the market is changing regardless. The scope for additional telecommunications activity is changing as business becomes more dependent, and for example, data we watch television on our phones now as well, which we didn't really do 5 years ago. Is this part of the incentive package which dampens concerns when you're talking to big providers, to big companies, that, okay, you're going to lose here, but you're going to gain here?
I mean, data services are key in this discussion, and I mean, I just wanted to comment also on the question of expensiveness. If you look at the development of the roaming retail prices, they are not that expensive anymore than they were once. So we started with 1.2 for a megabit in 2012, and we now at 0.5 per megabit, and this will go further down. So bill shock discussion is no longer at the center of the discussions. That we don't receive that many complaints as we had in the beginning of the roaming regulation, in particular on that field. But, and I think that's important, the consumption pattern in mobile is dramatically changing. As you said, I mean, what was voice at the beginning is now data. And data is the market that is increasing domestically as well as then, of course, when roaming. And I think when we look at the increase of domestic data services, this is very encouraging. I think this is what we also want to see. This gives new opportunities, and it's part of the connectivity debate we have now with the review proposal, for instance. And this is when we talk about the gigabyte society, and where we also see perspectives for the economy as a whole. The same applies, of course, in the context of roaming. That's just a bit more difficult, because when you provide strongly increasing data volumes, but you are dependent on the inputs, which is the wholesale price that you have to pay, then you have to find a way to accommodate that. But I think in principle, the increase of data consumption is what is in line with all the policies we are doing here. It's good, and we should find ways and solutions that we get win-win situations, as Mrs. Bachler has said correctly.
Pasek, do you think that Europe needs to be more ambitious with its telecommunications? Do you think that roaming should be something that isn't even in our mind, and that actually overall data prices in the longer term should be much lower to encourage enterprise?
I think yes, and I'm a very big supporter of this process. But as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, there is not the end of the way. I think we need some new ethics, also actions from the side of the Commission, from the side of the Parliament too. But I think that's not a bad situation also or very bad situation also for operators. I fully agree with the possibility to create a win-win position, because I have here also some other information. Between 2008 and 2015, the price for roaming was decreased by 22%, but the data roaming volume was increased more than 100%. So I think that's stay a good business also for the operators in the future, and I think also for the concerning future development, the two elements are important. Firstly, a well-balanced model because of the sustainability of systems, and secondly, a fair balance also to the citizens, to the customers, because I think we are the main element of this system, of all the system.
Okay, Ursula, who are the big losers at the moment in the digital market, and is there a section of society, is there a country, is there even a region which really suffers as a consequence of current policies?
I think for the time being, we have a situation where the end of roaming, as we just said, has not become a reality, despite the fact that it has been promised since yet many years. And I would very much subscribe to what the previous speaker just said, which is that this is not the end of the story. So the current pending measures and the new legislation that is about to be adopted is not the end, because it will not be the final abolishing of roaming fees. I think we have to be crystal clear on that. Why? Because the roam like at home concept is there, that's very good, but there are several measures that are going to be put in place to protect the providers. And that is the so-called fair use policy, which means that providers, in case of a risk of abuse, they can charge roaming fees. which is something that needs to be defined. But obviously it's a risk for consumers because you will not know exactly what kind of situation will, I mean, for the time being, we don't know exactly what type of situation will trigger such an abuse situation and would then theoretically lead to more fees for consumers. So one of our demands is very strongly to the member states, to the Commission, that it must be crystal clear when additional fees may be due, and that a fair use policy is in the first instance fair to the consumer, not necessarily a fair use from a provider side. It should be fair as well, of course, but it's a hypothetical concept that there would be misuses, and we have not seen them yet. We have to see whether there is a real risk, but it should, in a first instance, I think, be policies that are fair to consumers and allow really a roam like at home situation without fears.
Okay, Brian Curtis, do you see problems with this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to pick up that point because I think it's key to the consumer right across Europe. We shouldn't forget the telecommunications industry is massive and growing all the time. So, you know, whilst I accept that you have to have a fair use policy, I don't think that we need to go overboard and start crying tears for the industry when you think what they've taken off consumers in the past 10, 15 years. And I agree also when you said that let's get roaming done and then let's move on to data, because I think the lessons that we can learn from roaming will apply. We'll be having this same debate, except I probably won't be here because I'm from the UK. But someone else will be sat here having the same debate in 5-10 years' time. The other thing that we spoke of earlier about when I mentioned about bundled offers and things of that nature, I think that regulators should be consulting with consumer groups to make sure that all of these things are transparent, and so that the consumer.
Do they not do that at the moment?
Well, I'm not sure they do it enough.
Ursula's shaking her head.
Yes, I was just going to say I'm not a member of a consumer group, but I speak to a lot of them, and they would tell me that this should be happening a lot more.
When you look at the regulators and the relationship with the consumer groups, are you impressed?
Not at all. I think there is really, really a lot to do in that respect, because the application of the legislation, the enforcement and the respect and compliance with legislation is an absolute key issue, and it's the regulators who are in charge, and they are very often not connected with the consumers and the users of the services, but they could be much better informed and know much better what is going on in the market if they would establish a regular and systematic dialogue with consumer groups.
Let me ask both Dietrich. At the Commission, do you have regular systematic dialogues with consumer groups?
Yes, we do. So I'm heading a unit which is also in charge of monitoring implementation of the EU framework in telecommunications, and on an annual basis we are going to all the capitals to speak to stakeholders about the regulatory and market developments, and we are regularly meeting also the consumer associations of the respective countries. I mean, it's clear that it is not enough to meet once a year, but just to say we have a close contact with the European Association, here with BEOC of course, also on the issue on roaming, but apart from that we are also in contact with the national consumer associations.
Do you require from national regulators that they have a regular interface with consumer groups?
I mean, my understanding is that regulators, in any case, as one of the objectives they have to follow, the consumer's interest, and many of those NRAs are very taking that responsibility very seriously. So you have, for instance, one of the major problems that you face also when you talk with consumer associations is the transparency of the tariff system, for instance. That's a problem on the domestic markets in particular. So it's good to have a lot of different offers you can choose. So I think the choice is really something which is in favor of the consumers, but it's also sometimes difficult to compare. So for instance, what regulators in several member states have started to do is to provide on their web page or otherwise instruments where you can compare the different tariff systems offered. And I think in some member states this is also done in close cooperation with the consumer associations. I mean, I have to take what Mrs. Parkle says to what regular are these exchanges at the national level, this I don't know. But as I said, the consumer aspect and the consumer interest is certainly something that regulators have to follow and have to take into account when implementing.
Okay, Paul Shaki.
Very shortly only, I think that's also a very important element. We are now here in the European level and we are talking on this question from the European position. But, I was 2 times member of the national government and I remember the discussions also on the national level. I remember the privatization process concerning this question. So I think that's also an interest of the national governments and national parliaments to push their home reality in the member countries to the more serious solutions for their citizens, because that's also a political question, the question also of the social reality in the societies in member countries. I think that's an important element.
But Paul, is it harder for national government to change the market, or is it easier for that to be done at the European level, where there should be less political interference with lobby groups and political campaign money, for example?
I'm not able to say that which situation is easier, the European situation or the national situation, because the main elements of these situations are different. But I think that's necessary to cooperate between the national governments and the European level too, and it's necessary to meet a European push politically and also by legislation to the national governments to create and to try to create serious dialogue, of course, on the national level, and serious solutions too.
Okay, one thing struck me about the American example. What caused the American market to become less competitive, Ursula?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the big players have merged and that there has been less competition, as I said before.
Why does the American market permit that?
Because I guess there is less intervention.
Is that likely to happen here, Wolf Dietrich?
I think we have a quite different starting point and a different history development when it comes to the telecommunication market. So I think the liberalization that took place here from the 90s has really resulted in a vast number of different players. That's one of our problems, because we are talking about a digital single market, but in market terms we are not there. I mean, the US, you have a single market, but we don't. We still have 28 markets. Roaming would not exist without this anomaly. It should not be in a single market. So that's one of the problems that we face here. So I think also when it comes to competition terms, the situation in the union is not comparable to the States, and I think competition will drive also in the future the developments in the union.
Paul Shaki, do you see that there's the possibility for a true single market, or is there always going to be this grey border existing across the 28, 27, 26, 25 member states?
That's a very nice but very complex question, and I am not able to answer your question maybe in 2-3 minutes period. But I think that's an element and a very clear step to the creation of single market, and an important issue too. So that's the reason why I am a big fan of the continuation of this process. Yes.
Okay. Yes, Brian Curtis.
Yeah, just a small point on that. I mean, competition, yes. We all seek that competition within the market, but we mustn't slip back to where we were. The big companies virtually formed a cartel. No matter what country you're in, they made the running. So I think that the regulators need to keep their eye firmly on this over the next couple of years, and I sincerely hope they will speak to the consumers group, because the consumers group will give them the evidence to back that up, because they have it. That's the purpose of their being virtually. So we mustn't slip back into the old cartel situation.
So it doesn't seem a very mature process where we have to suggest that regulators should really listen to the consumers. What's wrong?
Well, I think we are on a learning curve there. I think it's a new development that we look at the legislation, the enforcement all together. Typically the European Union, or the European Commission, better said, as such, does not have competences on enforcement, so there is still a very diverse market when it comes to the real effectiveness of legislation, because the legislators, they implement the legislation, but then it depends on the member state how to enforce it through the regulators. And there we have a very, very scattered picture. I would like to mention, if I may, in this context of the single market and where it is going to lead us, that of course we very much believe in the end of roaming, and I mean the real end of roaming as a further step, and we need, I think, another legislative layer that will come hopefully soon in order to make that reality. But there is another issue which I think many consumers are unhappy about, which is so-called international telephone calls. So I'm not talking about the roaming situation where you travel outside your country and then phone back home, but it's when you, for example, you work in a different country and you phone your family at home, and there the costs are still tremendously high. So, for example, we have done a short survey with our member organizations in several countries. You easily pay €1 per minute if you, for example, call a friend in another member state or your family at home. And this is a situation that has not been regulated, there has not been intervention, but we think it's nearly equally important to consumers in a single market, and it's not what you should expect when you live in a single market, that if you phone another country, you have to face
Particularly if they're
high costs.
literally 2 miles away.
Exactly,
In Northern Ireland, for example, where I come from, we go to the country house, which is 2 hours drive away. It's in the Republic of Ireland. You need 2 phones if you want to save money as well, something in this. How does this exist in the modern day? Why do we not have a way through that? We're coming to the close of the program just now. Let's talk a bit more about the politics of this as well, which caused so much controversy recently. Do consumers really see the difference anymore between roaming and data? Is there any difference in terms of what they see as a phone call and what they see as data use, when you can call on WhatsApp, you can call on Facebook, you can call on Skype, and that doesn't register as a regular phone call anymore? Is this regulatory system behind the curve? Does this whole framework need to change in the future? Pashaki.
You're absolutely right. That's a very interesting challenge for all of us, and we see that the reality generate new questions. So we are waiting also for the application of new technologies. So absolutely, I think that's an open question for the future, and I'm sure that's only middle of the way. We have to continue also in the future.
Ulf Dietrich.
Yeah, I think the future is data services. That's clear. I mean, at the moment, still the revenues from voice are quite significant, but the trend is clear. The data services is the future, and I think that's why also we are in the middle of a process of reviewing our telecom framework, so the regulatory framework overall, to take that into account, these new developments. It's not only that data is the future, but it's mobile data. So people want to be online wherever. And I think in that regard, this will involve new technologies. As you said, 5G is one promising aspect here. It involves questions like how can we provide for the necessary spectrum for the operators so that the networks can be rolled out speedily, rapidly, following the developments here. And I think this is at the moment also underway. The Commission has made a proposal for such a new telecommunications code in September, and that is now also with the co-legislator, and we hope to see results soon there as well.
Brian Curtis, do you think the European debate is behind the curve, or is just technology going to trump everything?
You're absolutely right. I just made a note. Who knows where we're going to be this time next year, but mobile data is the future. Let's just hope that we learn the lessons of roaming and we take that forward.
Okay, let's begin a summary in just a moment. It strikes me that transparency is one of the big tools that hasn't been leveraged yet. Would you all agree with that, Wolf Dietrich?
I think the legislator has addressed it quite heavily. So if you look at the TSM, and that is what is already in place. So when the Roam Like at Home concept was introduced, there were also complementary provisions which try to enhance the transparency as much as possible. So there are a lot of obligations under the the current roaming regulation to provide for transparency. As a matter of fact, and that is what I learn in exchange with consumer associations, is that many of the problems that are reported in the telecoms area concern transparency. As I said, not necessarily in the roaming context, but overall.
Okay.
And
Let me just ask, Balashaki, do you think that if they were to focus on one thing and do it better, transparency would produce results in different areas quickly?
I think yes. The transparency is a very key element of all of the very complicated system, and I fully agree with the partners. That's must be in the focus, in the very focus of the process also in the future.
Ursula Paco.
Yes, indeed, comparability of tariffs on one hand, but also comparability of services is absolutely key. In relation to your question before about voice versus data services, it's absolutely key for us that consumers have a choice, and a choice of quality services, and they must know why they use voice telephony compared to an OTT, so over-the-top service, for example, because you have confidentiality guaranteed if you use a telephony services, when you may have concerns about personal data protection when you use one of the new OTT services, but that must be very clear, and there must be improvement that also OTT services meet the expectations of consumers.
Okay, I've got 30 seconds to do a wrap up now, so let me just thank you all for that. The wholesale level, the market is still some work to be done in this. Transparency is key to getting the right kind of deal for consumers, and to making sure that competition stays a better part of what is yet to become a single European market, by contrast with the American market as well. The East-West divide we spoke about as well, how all markets across Europe are not the same. There are different prices paid and different services offered in different ways, and also the ownership of companies across Europe is consolidated in certain areas much more than in others. Brexit, the unknown outcomes of Brexit, what's going to happen when Europe may or may not lose a large part of its consumer market, and a very high data consumption part of that market as well. And the roaming, the complicated timing of this whole process grew out of a cartel situation in the past, but which everybody seemed to agree today the general orientation is good, things seem on track, and that ultimately there's still much more to be done as new technology emerges, and this regulatory framework will be compelled to shift in the medium and long term. Let me thank all our guests today. Balashaki from Slovakia, Wolf-Dietrich Grossman from DG Connect, Ursula Paco from Buick, and Richard Curtis from the European Economic and Social Committee, and also to Christina from Babasboy University. Thank you to all our guests today. I'm Brian Maguire.